Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, currently having a bit of a festive cold, shall we say. Just a little bit of so my voice would be a tiny bit hoarser than usual, and I say that like it's usually really hoarse, but you know what I mean. But anyway, it has been a wonderful year. Well, not a wonderful year in many other ways, but a wonderful year for reading. And I thought today I'd go over some of my favourite non-fiction books that were released this year. I'm going to do a separate one on fiction, which I'm currently trying to find a way of narrowing down about 25 books into some other number, so we'll see what that looks like. But here are my non-fiction picks from the year, and I've been quite specific to try and narrow it down of only choosing books that were released this year, and that in some ways has made it a tiny bit easier, but it was still hard to narrow this list down. So let's get started. First up, we have Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lin. I read this fairly early into the year and just absolutely adored this. So this book is really clever in many ways, I think. It basically takes the sort of history of LGBTQ struggle, and it puts it alongside Jeremy Atherton Lin's own experiences of visiting bars and sort of being part of kind of queer nightlife. And what's really fascinating is how this book manages to sort of balance those two things. So he'll talk about, for example, a bar that he goes to, and then he'll sort of put this alongside a story of how in the past a gay bar had been raided, or by police, or the there have been sort of other parts where it hadn't been able to be its sort of self, or people going to the bar had sort of had a really troubled experience because of sort of queer rights and where they stood. So a really fascinating book, and I love this in just so many ways. It's really funny, it's really bawdy, but it's also really clever and really political in how it kind of talks about what's happened to sort of many queer people in their lives over sort of the last sort of 50-60 years. So I just thought this was such a brilliant book, and it made me just, it is a book that really sort of stays with you, just because there's a lot that goes on in it that is so heartbreaking, but also so funny and warm and brilliant. So I really love this and really highly recommend this book. Next, I had Rafia Zakaria's Against White Feminism, which is a book, again, I read fairly early into the year, and I just thought was really cleverly done. So in this book, she argues that sort of the way that we often see feminism and the way that women's liberation has been sort of put forward has often been at the expense of women of colour, and how a lot of the time the movement focuses on the needs of a very specific group of women, particularly white women. And this is not to sort of demonize white women in the book. She's sort of very careful to sort of state her terms, but she's sort of against this idea of feminism being co-opted as sort of just a, let's get let's break a few glass ceilings and get a few women CEOs and then job done. She makes the real case that actually there's a lot missing in that kind of belief, or that kind of focus, and as a result that there are so many women who are left out. And she gives her own personal examples of, for example, going to an event that was meant to sort of be to celebrate cultures nominally, and in that she was basically just meant to she was basically told that the idea was going to be that she put on a sari, sold some sort of vaguely sort of Indian and Pakistani looking bangles, and called it a day. And she felt really dehumanized by that, by the sheer fact that she'd been sort of reduced down to a way of commodifying her culture, and a way of sort of, if she wasn't selling who she was and sort of packaging it in a specific neat way, then it didn't matter. And so I think this book is really interesting for that. It's so well focused. It again does that really interesting thing of sharing sort of personal stories alongside the sort of the timeline of how things have been looking politically. And I just thought this book is really clever and just well worth going into more people's hands. I think it's a really good one. Next up is a book that I've spoken about quite a lot, this year, I think, since reading it, and that is Shon Faye's The Transgender Issue. And I'll sort of say here what I've sort of said a few times in some ways, but I think, I mean, read this book, it's brilliant, but I think part of the book's brilliance is that it's so accessible. I think so often it is the case that a book that's sort of vaguely political or talks about a sort of contentious issue will sort of be one of two things, which will either be a personal memoir that articulates it, and again, nothing wrong with that, but it can mean, and Shon Faye talks about this in the introduction, it can mean that for trans women or trans people more generally, there's just so much of a focus on surgery, on transition, on what they wear, and for her, she sort of says that minimizes actually the wider discussion around trans lives and around violence perpetrated against trans people. So it avoids that sort of side of thing, but I think also what's really interesting is it avoids this sort of becoming a fairly partisan thing. I think I've definitely read lots of political books or books that kind of argue around a certain point, and you kind of get the feeling that actually this is just a lot of people in a bit of an echo chamber nodding and saying yes, because actually the terms used in this book or the way it's framed presuppose a certain level of knowledge and kind of being already in that discussion. And I think what's so clever about the transgender issue is it avoids that, and so it does feel like a book that if you were someone who held certain opinions against trans folk, this book actually could get to you in some ways. It could reach in and kind of have that discussion with you, and I think that's really clever. I think particularly because, you know, Shon Faye again in interviews has said that she didn't want this to be a book that just, you know, basically the right people picked up and kind of just nodded along to. She wanted to have proper discussion, and it's been interesting seeing people's responses and reviews of this book, where often people who were quite critical of trans people or trans rights haven't really fully been able to argue against the book, because actually the cases made in the book are quite solid. So I think this is a really great book, and for anybody wanting to find out more about trans lives and trans rights, I think this is a fantastic place to start. And Shon Faye is just, I mean, she's brilliant anyway. If you ever hear any interviews with her, she's hilarious, she's incredible, but also brilliantly clever, and I think that shines in this book. Next up is another book that I absolutely fell in love with. All of these, I think, so far have been books I got as advance copies. But Free by Lea Ypi is just such a brilliant book. Now, this book, I think initially about sort of the first half or 2/3, I was enjoying it, but didn't fully get what was going on. So this book talks about her experiences growing up in Albania. And particularly her as a young girl growing up at a time where there were sort of seismic shifts in the politics of the country. So we're talking a complete handover of power, a complete change of power between various forces. That there is a sort of, there'd been a religious clampdown, so her parents, you know, she only finds out several, you know, I think at about 10 or something, that she is Muslim and that her family is Muslim, because she's never been to a mosque, because she doesn't have to, because, well, not because she doesn't have to, sorry, because she can't really, because religion is something that is really sort of stamped down on. So she finds it really interesting, because she'll sort of talk about, she sort of makes a comment to her parents about like, oh, it's really interesting, I heard this about Muslims, and her parents are like, so you do realize you do realize, love, we're Muslims too. But that's kind of part of it, and so what's really fascinating for me about this book is it kind of takes those sort of typical, not necessarily tropes, but those kinds of things that you might expect in a memoir of someone growing up young talking about a specific place, and it's written in a kind of slightly infantile, not infantile language, but it's written in a fairly basic language that feels like you're in the moment with her as a child. But there is this moment towards the end of the book where suddenly things shift and the language changes slightly, and her outlook changes slightly, and then suddenly the innocence of that voice that we had at the beginning of the book suddenly means something very, very different, and we feel that innocence really being shattered. And I just thought this book was lovely. I mean, that doesn't sound lovely given what I've said. I think it's really powerfully done, and I think there is so much warmth and humanity that's kept in this book whilst arguing and talking about some absolute atrocities that have happened. So yeah, this is really cleverly done, and just a book that I found really interesting. It was also shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize, which is a non-fiction book prize, and very rightly so. I think this book is fantastic, and that final passage of this book I read sort of breathlessly, just racing through it because it was just so gripping and brilliant. Also shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize, as well as the Wainwright Prize for Nature. And you'll notice these next few are very naturey ones. This is what happens when I read a nature book prize. I love everything. I think I've narrowed it down to 4. But this book, Cal Flynn's book, Islands of Abandonment, I just think is absolutely brilliant. So this book is all about spaces where humans were sort of once involved, and as soon as humans have stepped away and abandoned those places for whatever reason, nature has sort of taken back over in quite profound and interesting ways. So on some angles that is, you know, the expected ones like Chernobyl, where kind of what it's looked like since humans left that because of the sort of nuclear disaster. But then it also delves into some other really interesting areas, so parts of Cyprus and sort of North Cyprus, where the kind of these sort of zones that have been abandoned because of sort of militarization and sort of war. Then you've got Detroit in the US, where because of sort of essentially people fleeing the area because of the lack of opportunities and because of violence and other things, that there have been some areas where nature's sort of taken back over. And it's fascinating because this book shouldn't work. It's so many sort of little fragments of places and things, and it feels like quite a narrow, or like quite a sort of bizarre thread to tie them all together. But actually, when you're reading the book, this really just adds up and makes something very interesting. You know, it would be so simple for this book to basically say, here's another place, oh look, it was abandoned, this is what happened. That isn't the case with this book. This book kind of keeps building an argument behind this that you don't really see is there until kind of you get towards the end of the book and you realize sort of how this is all meshed together. It's really brilliantly done, and this was a sort of a really interesting standout book, and probably one of the books that I read this year that was just so unlike any other, and I really loved it for that. As I mentioned, a few of these other books are related to nature and were ones that I read through the Wainwright Prize shortlists. And the first of these is English Pastoral, or Pastoral. I'm never quite sure how I say that word, by James Rebanks. And this is a beautiful book. He basically talks about the inheritance of a farm, or kind of some land from his family, and how in trying to use that land and sort of work with it to kind of yield the best results, there's this whole discussion going on about traditional versus modern farming. And again, that doesn't sound on the surface like it'd be the most exciting thing in the world, but there is such an angry passion to this book, and sort of really fiery way of approaching this that I just think is brilliant, because he is angry on one hand at the destruction of the natural world. He is also really hopeful about how we can return to certain forms of working with nature, and it really slides together and kind of hangs together really beautifully. And this was one of the winners of the Wainwright Prize, alongside Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is another one of my books of this year for non-fiction. This is a book all about fungi and how it all shapes how the entire world that we live in. And again, it reminded me a lot of Robert Macfarlane's Underland, of this idea of the kind of the unseen, all these sort of parts of nature that we wouldn't otherwise normally see. You know, we might see the odd like little mushroom or some fungi or whatever, but there are all these little rhizomes and things underneath the soil supporting the roots. And it really, for me, again, highlights that brilliant thing that I love about nature, which is this sort of symbiosis of everything. So the fact that you've got these things underneath the roots that they need a certain type of nutrient, or they basically need access to the sun. Plants can get that, but in return they also need to give something to these plants, and so they provide some nutrients to trees and other kind of things with roots. And it's just really brilliantly done, and it's such, what I love about this book is it's such a kind of passion project of this author. And it kind of, you just, I don't know, for me, I just couldn't help but be charmed by it. It's so interesting, it's so detailed, and the pictures used within the book are just stunning as well. So it's a book that's well worth checking out, I think. And the final one from the Nature Prize, I promise, well, sort of, is Seed to Dust by Marc Hammer. And this is a book that I just absolutely adore. It is a book where this man, Marc Hammer, talks about his relationship with his garden. Well, a garden that he's doing for this woman who sort of seems to live alone, and their kind of relationship that they build through all of it. And what is stunning about this book for me is that their relationship is so interesting and varied, but it's almost told in these little excerpts, these sort of little vignettes, but with the most beautiful language. And so we get little sort of insights into Marc Hammer's life and his past, and times when he was homeless, for example. We have him talking about his childhood, him sort of reflecting on sexuality and his own sexuality, him talking about his wife, and then he also starts kind of really exploring the beauty of this world. But it's done with such tenderness, and I just found this so charming as a book, and I just couldn't stop reading it. I just, it's about 400 pages, and I raced through this. I did not want to do anything really more than just read this book. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book, and I just love the way he speaks so passionately and so powerfully about nature. Next up, we have a book that's a slightly late contender for this year's, for sort of best books of this year for me, and that is Everybody by Olivia Laing. And so Olivia Laing is an author who I think I've only read Crudo of hers before, which I loved and just thought was incredibly funny, as a novel of theirs. But Everybody is a non-fiction essay, or sort of set of essays where they talk a lot about freedom and about bodies. And again, on the sort of surface, so many of these things should not work. They sound sort of completely disconnected and everything like that. But I think what's so brilliant about Olivia Laing's writing in this is she manages to pull together some really kind of fascinating parts about how we as humans view bodies and sexuality and so many other things. So, for example, she references Wilhelm Reich's book, which the name of which now escapes me, but was A Book of Dreams, I think it was, which is him talking about his childhood with Peter Reich, his father, or vice versa, I can't remember which one's which is a book that I mentioned in my Kate Bush video earlier this year, and then by wonderful coincidence, Olivia Laing also talks about it, and she talks about how there's this sort of this sort of attempt of science sometimes to understand the things that seem slightly more abstract and don't seem quite as typical as other things. So all this writing in there about the wonders of things around sexuality and of joy and all of those sorts of things. But then she also draws a sort of line through that with things like Freud and sort of other psychoanalysts and how they saw sexuality and the mind and various other things. Then there's a sort of line that kind of keeps being drawn through to how we in the modern day see bodies, and particularly how bodies are viewed under capitalism or under the sort of threat of fascism, and how those sort of political and sort of those sort of ideologies and thought patterns, how they view bodies and how they view people, and then linked to that things like Black Lives Matter. And actually in that struggle, so much is spoken about bodies and about, for example, the dangers of basically existing while black, particularly in the US and in various other countries, the UK included, unfortunately. But there's that bodies are kind of under threat and bodies are seen as threatening themselves. And so all of this is really, really clever, and I'm not doing this at all any justice. Olivia Laing is far cleverer than I am and much better at explaining this. But it talks a lot about this idea of constrainment versus freedom when it comes to bodies, and what we really mean when we talk about that. And I just thought it was such a clever book, but also really quite accessible and interesting. Plus, their writing is just great. And Olivia Laing uses they them pronouns, and talks as well about their identity as being someone who doesn't really always identify. I think if I'm right, they use both she and they, and I think part of the discussion comes up about how their body works if it's not necessarily always seen as being a woman's body, or vice versa. So really, really interesting. Last in my top 10, and there'll be a couple of honorable mentions, so this is not the last one, I guess, overall, but last from my top 10 is These Precious Days by Anne Patchett. She's an author who I've only read one novel of hers, The Dutch House, which I adored and just thought was incredible. And some of the reasons I loved that book are in These Precious Days, just this beautiful quality with language of this real sort of lovingness and warmth that comes through that I really adored. So this is a set of essays, and in it she talks a lot about things like family, relationships between people, history, the sort of ties that bind people, and a little bit about writing as well. And you know, most of these essays sort of fall under kind of, you know, they're very beautifully written and they sort of fall into kind of things you might expect. And then the pandemic hits, and so many of these essays are then sort of almost reformed and reshaped by them. And so Anne Patchett kind of gives her sort of views on various things and sort of her responses to things. But the titular essay is quite a long one and is sort of a really big thrust to this essay, to this collection. And it is all about her relationship with a friend of hers. And this woman, without spoiling too much, you know, these two women are kind of already growing quite close, and then this woman falls very, very sick, and it is during a time of the pandemic, and so hospitals and getting care and all those sorts of things aren't really possible, and it just turns into this absolutely beautiful exploration of friendship and love and care, and it really got to me. It was just such a beautifully done essay. It was so moving, and I really do urge you to check it out. I think she's just got a style that's very accessible and really interesting. You know, some of these essays are very short, but that kind of titular essay towards the end is just heartbreaking. But the thing that makes it just so brilliant to me as well is there is always a real sense of generosity and warmth in Anne Patchett's writing during this essay, and during all of these all of the collection, where you really get a sense of she just sort of is prioritizing care and being a good human and looking after people, and then suddenly all the context of all the essays earlier in the collection make a lot more sense. All of these things about who is family, who are the people you look out for, what can you be within your community, all of that really is then sort of shown in action towards the end of this collection. I think it's brilliant, and it really moved me in so many ways. I think it's great, and I urge everyone to check it out if you have a chance. It's lovely. It's really not always the easiest reading, but it's very heartwarming, as well as breaking. But it's very nice, beautiful writing nonetheless. I did say I had a top 10. I had a few that I couldn't I was juggling and trying to work out if they would fit. I think these are still brilliant books, and so take this as a top 12 or a top 10, however you want it. It would be weird not to include these two books, I think, because I've enjoyed them both for different reasons. The first of these is I Belong Here by Anita Sethi. This book is really, really clever. It takes a look at Anita Sethi basically experienced a horrible racist attack while on a train, and part of what was being said by this man on the train was, you know, go back to where you belong. And so this book basically makes a case of her belonging here, and that nature and land belongs to everyone. And it does it in this really interesting way, because we have Anita Sethi going on a journey through going on a long nature walk basically and following a certain path, and in doing so kind of reclaiming a sense of belonging for herself and her own identity, reclaiming a sense of belonging in terms of being British and being kind of in this British countryside and understanding that she exists here and everything like that, but also this real kind of groundedness and sort of link in with nature. I think I've mentioned this every time I've spoken about the book, but one of my favorite things about it is it does this really clever thing with using words that we would associate with violence, so scar, fell, all these sorts of things, or things that involve injury, and talking about how those are also words that are used in the natural world to describe certain formations of rock or landscape or whatever. And it's so brilliantly handled, whilst then also going through the history of looking at actually there used to be many people of colour in various parts of the UK, whether during the Roman Empire or otherwise, and that was seen as absolutely normal. And it's very strange that this person telling her to go back to where she belongs or where she comes from kind of has missed this point, and she knows this history better than he does. So yeah, that's a book that I'd absolutely very, very highly recommend. And the other sort of honourable mention slash other book in my top 12 is Consumed by Arja Barber, and this is a book that's really interesting for many, many reasons. So she talks a lot about fast fashion and the sort of the unsustainability of the fashion industry and the various sort of things around it, but she also has a really good understanding of where people fit within that. So I think it's very easy in many of these things to say, oh, people shouldn't buy fast fashion from H&M or Primark or whatever. But what she's very good at is kind of saying, okay, what can we all do? Because and also where does that fit for people on certain budgets, right? If certain people feel like they have to shop there, what are the alternatives? What kinds of things can we do? How do we change the system? And this book's really accessible for talking more about systemic change as well, but it also does focus a little bit on personal change, and Arja Barber brings in her own sort of personal experiences, sort of working in sort of the fashion industry, or working in the industry more broadly, but also of bringing in things like colonialism and the impact that has. So actually we talk a lot about clothing waste and whatever, but we're one side of this and we're not necessarily looking at, for example, the garment workers who are paid nothing and have terrible work conditions. We're not often thinking about where the dumped landfill of all of these items goes, and she focuses a lot on this clothes market in Ghana, where often, at one point I think a set of clothes setting on fire accidentally killed several people and destroyed loads of property. And actually this is completely not part of our day-to-day thinking on this topic. So Arja Barber is brilliant in many, many ways, and I think this book is a really clever, interesting one for learning a little bit more about the fashion industry. And those have been my top 12 slash whatever books, non-fiction books from this year, all released this year. And they are just such a broad and interesting range of books. I really do urge you to check out whichever ones seem interesting to you. I have had a really great time spending time with non-fiction this year as well. When I come to do fiction, you'll see that I've also had lots of fiction books I've loved, but non-fiction can occupy such an interesting place in our lives, because I think I think non-fiction books generally are getting really good at balancing multiple genres and really thinking about a really nuanced take on many things. So they're not just sort of historical things of just sort of, and then this date this happened and this other day. These are very readable and really interesting ones. So anyway, that ramble aside, I really urge you to check them out. I think they're all brilliant, and I hope you have also had a great year of reading. I'd love to hear if you've read any of these, if you've had any other really good non-fiction books released this year that you'd really highly recommend. I'm always on the search for more. And apart from that, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.